Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 10, where we'll be looking at Jewish life and literature between 200 BCE and 100 CE. 100 CE marks the end of a biblical period. By that point, all of the books in the New Testament will have been written, but not canonized. The 200 years before the birth of Jesus are a significant time in Jewish history, as we shall see. The 200 years before Jesus' birth also provides us the historical context out of which Jesus and later the early Christian community emerges. In 2017, Canada will celebrate its 150th anniversary. In that time, we have developed and evolved. We find ourselves in that evolution and as a product of that evolution. By analogy, the 200 years before Jesus was born provides us with a stage on which Jesus and the early Christian community emerge. Early in the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucids were still the overlords in Judea. Their loss to Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 meant they owed the Romans tribute. To pay for this, they unsuccessfully looted the temple treasury during the reign of Onias. The situation for the Jewish community deteriorated with the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes beginning in 175 BCE. Epiphanes means God or Zeus manifest, and he probably believed in his own label. He was ambitious, eccentric, and possibly a bit mad. Another hit to the temple cult came with the bribing of Jewish temple leaders for the position of high priest. This upset the customary inheritance of the high priesthood through the Zadokite line. Consider all these elements as stoking the flame to leading towards Jewish rebellion. The process of Hellenization had been going on for at least a century. The Jewish community had accommodated Hellenistic influences peacefully and would do so again during the Maccabean and Roman periods. Archaeology reveals this in the use of pagan iconography in Jewish homes and synagogues. In short, the Greek or Hellenistic way of life pervaded almost all aspects of Jewish life. It was not until the 170s and 160s that a strong reaction to Hellenization emerged. We see this in the upsurge of Jewish pietism, for example, in the renewal of commitment to the Torah among both priests and laity in the early 2nd century BCE. Throughout human history, we've come to see the many revolutions as examples of these countercultural movements. After Rome had thwarted an attempt by Antiochus Epiphanes to take over Egypt, the ego-bruised overlord entered Jerusalem on the Sabbath, slaughtering innocent people and looting the temple. The temple was converted to pagan worship, and by 167 BCE, customary Jewish practices were outlawed. In reaction, the Hasidim practiced passive resistance, suffering torture and death as a consequence. A radical turning point came in the village of Modein on a day when Seleucid troops forced a pagan sacrifice. Instead, Mattathias led his neighbors in killing the soldiers. Though he did not survive, his acts spark a resistance movement carried on by his sons, Judas the Maccabee, which means hammerer, Jonathan and Simon. Judas was a brilliant guerrilla fighter who, in December, the Jewish month of Kislev, 164 BCE, liberated the temple and cleansed and rededicated it. This is commemorated each year in Hanukkah. The war between the Maccabees and the Seleucid regime was punctuated by truces, negotiations, and diplomatic exploration. Ultimately, total political independence had been won around 135 BCE. This began the Hasmonean dynasty, named for the Ben Hashmon family, the real name of the Maccabees. Israel had nearly a century of political and religious independence. The Maccabees were generally popular, though pietists were hostile towards them, since they claimed the title of high priest, which was reserved for the Zadokites, and since they were exposed to corpse impurity, which was a violation of the temple cult. Moreover, their rule was not a Davidic rule. For religious hardliners, the Maccabees were not seen so favorably. And finally, in 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem, and the Jewish homeland was thereafter subordinate to Roman either directly or indirectly rule. The Hasmonean dynasty came to an end. Herod was named Rome's client king of the Jews, although he was left to his own devices to make the claim stick. He reigned from 40 to 4 BCE. This was just around the time of the birth of Jesus. Herod was an able ruler and an ambitious builder. His splendid reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple was his most famous achievement, with the founding of Caesarea a close second. Herod was considered a Jew since his mother was a Jew, but was hated by many as his allegiance was to Rome, and he patronized paganism, even if he had rebuilt the temple. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE aimed at quashing rebellion once and for all from the Jewish zealots who gained popular support. Later, in 132 to 135 CE, a second Jewish revolution erupted under Simon Bar Kokhba. Again, Rome brought its awesome power to bear and Judea was ravaged. Jerusalem was reconstructed under Hadrian as a pagan city. The period following the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty was a watershed time in Jewish history. The Pharisees and Sadducees emerged, the Hasidim and the Zadokite priesthood disappeared, the Tanakh was canonized, and Torah and Temple were central symbols for all forms of Judaism, including early Christianity. Competing viewpoints in Judaism were emerging at this time. Each denomination, as Howard Young calls it, thought of themselves as Jewish, but obliged to recognize the Jewishness of their rivals. Common to the denominations is the oneness of God. At this time, the Shema became central to Jewish liturgy and worship. The Torah was a sum total of God's authoritative teaching. Embodied within this or derived from it was the halakha, the way, authoritative and binding customs. Mitzvahot, or commandments, were obligatory principles that emerged all from the Torah's interpretation. The disagreements between the denominations had to do with how the Torah was to be interpreted, and about who had the authority to interpret it. In a way, the disagreements between the Christian families are all rooted in how the Bible is interpreted, and who had the authority to interpret it. This is why Howard Young see the term denomination as appropriate for use amongst all of the religious groups emerging at this time. An aspect of traditional Torah piety that must be understood is ritual impurity. This has nothing to do with sin or virtue, rather it can be understood analogous to bacterial contamination. Some hostile and false reconstructions of classic Judaism have been obsessed with ritual purity. The Essenes may have been, but there were a variety of views. Influences of these notions of ritual impurity continue even today. In many Jewish traditions, there is a form of baptism known as the mikvah. In Christianity, of course, for many denominations, baptism is the norm. For most Christian communities, baptism is understood in part as being a ritual purification. The first denomination that Howard and Young look at are the Pharisees. Today, the common usage of the term Pharisee refers to someone who is obsessively concerned with rules, giving more attention to the outward forms of religion than its spirit, and who is self-righteous and hypocritical. This definition, however, is erroneous. Historically, the term applied to a pietist movement comprised largely of laity. Their name comes from a Hebrew word meaning the excluded or the separated. It was perhaps like Christian, a slur that stuck as a public nickname and perhaps became a badge of honor. The Pharisees, however, did not use the term among themselves. They preferred, rather, the term of the ancient wise men, the Hakamim. Recent scholars are less willing to offer unified overviews of Pharisees. Why is that? Because there are no surviving descriptions written by the Pharisees themselves, and secondly, because the sources have their own biases. For example, the New Testament's conception of the Pharisees were as legalists and hypocrites. The Essenes' conception of the Pharisees was that they were too lenient in their observance of the Torah. Pharisees comprised of people from the middle orders of society, tradespeople, artisans, merchants, farmers, and others. Few were from lower ranks, and few were priestly adherents. They were led by a company of lay scholar saints whose authority was their power to persuade through reason and example rather than hereditary office or charisma. Ezra and his colleagues and successors loomed large in the Pharisaic tradition, but Moses was considered their founder and supreme teacher. Based on this, we can see how some biblical historians place Jesus within this denomination. Tradition and scripture tell us that Jesus' father was a carpenter. As well, we can see that Jesus' teaching were remarkable and drew many disciples around him. The Pharisees saw the necessity of adapting Jewish piety to the changed conditions of life in the Jewish homeland to enable the ordinary Jew to be a good Jew in the modern world. And this was accomplished in two ways. First, through free interpretation of the scripture by their scholarly leaders. And second, through an authoritative oral tradition, that is, traditional teachings of the great Pharisaic scholars. To this was added the principle of authority, which accepted interpretation only if it could be attributed to a recognized leader. Pharisaism was centered in observance of the Torah. Actions and purposes were more important than words or doctrines. The keeping of the Torah was not a legalistic quest for the favor of a cold, demanding God, but a response to the goodness of a loving parent. The principle of intention was central to the Pharisees. It held that the purpose a person had in mind when doing a deed determined its validity. There were two major schools of thought among the Pharisees. The Hillel view put people ahead of the letter of the law. The Shammai view stuck up for the Torah. The Galilean Pharisees, who disputed points of law with Jesus, tended toward the Shammite view. The teachings of Jesus inclined toward the Hillel view. In the Gospels, we hear of Jesus constantly disputing amongst the Pharisees. These were not uncommon in Jesus' time. This is how Pharisees among themselves would have argued. After the time of Jesus, Jewish Christian leaders found themselves locked in dispute with Pharisaic leaders for recognition in the community. This antagonism is reflected in the way that the Gospels of Matthew and John were edited. Later, Gentile Christians tended to go even further and read into these family arguments a we versus they hostility. This antagonism has persisted through the centuries and has been the cause of Christian persecution of Jews in many periods. Regarding civil authority, the Pharisees were willing to put up with just about any government, so long as Jewish religious practices were not utterly repressed. Pharisees shared the general expectation of a messianic age. They believed their obligation was to create a congenial environment for the Messiah's coming by living a life of Torah faithfulness. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees emerged with a form of piety and an institution, that is, the synagogue, which they had not invented, but rather adapted to carry on Jewish life and religion. And now we turn to the Sadducees. This group consisted of prominent priests and other aristocrats, with the high priest as its head. Aristocratic religion is usually traditional and conservative, and such was the case of the Sadducees. For example, theirs was a strict literal interpretation of the Torah. Josephus, the New Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the rabbinic literature all accuse the Sadducean leadership of violent and unprincipled behavior to attain its ends. The Pharisees were their religious and political adversaries. The Sadducees rejected the resurrection of the dead and angels, unlike the Pharisees. The temple for them was the power base and source of wealth. Since the high priest was a Sadducee, and since the Romans placed him at the head of the Sanhedrin, that is, the council of Jewish leaders responsible for Jewish-Roman relations, there was close contact between them and the Romans. The Essenes, translated as purified one or healers, are described by Josephus, Philo, and the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. They were a sect in the sociological sense. In other words, they withdrew from what they understood as being the sinful world to live their higher form of life uncontaminated. The three sources recognized the Dead Sea as a major center for them. Philo and Pliny noted their celibacy, while Josephus said some were married. The majority of scholars conclude that the ancient community at Qumran were made up of Essenes. However, some scholars believe they were not, for the following reasons. First, they never linked themselves to the Essenes, instead calling themselves Covenanters. Their writing suggests they represented a radical priestly wing of the Pietist movement. The Covenanters were once led by a charismatic priest who had the ability from God to discern all the secrets of the prophets. The community was rigidly hierarchical, with the sons of Zadok at the head. Some scholars now believe that the Covenanters held views that were identified as Sadducean or a Sadducean sect. A reevaluation of the archaeological data casts doubts on them being a monastic group, because skeletons of women and children and luxury goods have been found. What can be said is that the Qumran sect believe a great apocalyptic war was about to erupt in which the sons of light would be victorious. They would be installed in the Jerusalem temple, and Jewish life and institutions would be restored according to the sect's teaching. Ultimately, the sect was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. The Zealots were a group that agreed with Pharisees on religious matters, but disagreed with their attitude toward Rome. Looking back to the success of the Maccabean revolt and spurred on by apocalyptic fervor, they counseled armed resistance. They dealt harshly with those who were not enthusiastic about their campaign against Rome. But there was also infighting. Their efforts flared into war by 66 CE. Their heroic defense of Masada by only a handful of zealots, ending with their mass suicide rather than surrender to Rome, was legendary. Tension between Jerusalem and Samaria goes back to the founding of Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom in about 900 BCE. It intensified during the post-exilic reconstruction when the Samaritans sought to gain a foothold in the Jerusalem temple cult, and on the other hand, to impede the refortification of Jerusalem. The final major event was the destruction of the counter-temple on Mount Gerizim by the Hasmonean John Hyrcanus. The Samaritans were a localized and generally conservative denomination led by hereditary priests. Their scripture only consisted of the Pentateuch. Rabbinic practice treated them as marginal and suspect keepers of the Torah. Common or folk Judaism was a term coined by Professor E.P. Sanders to designate the customs and usages shared by most self-conscious Jews of Judea, Galilee, and neighboring areas during the early classical period. One of these customs was concern for ritual purity, as witnessed by the numerous ritual baths known as mikvaot, which archaeologists have found on Jewish occupation sites from this time. Other customs, such as maintaining standards of modesty or men wearing the traditional fringe garment known as the zizith, were so much a part of normal everyday life that they were probably done without conscious awareness that one was keeping mitzvah, which is a moral deed or religious duty. Rabbinic literature used the term the people of the land to describe the less observant members of the Galilean and Judean communities. They probably stood outside of an identifiable denomination. They consisted of tax collectors, prostitutes, and persons whose work make them ritually unclean. They were probably ignorant of the finer points of Torah piety. Matthew, the most rabbinic gospel, suggests that Jesus directed much of his energy towards the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Perhaps the people of the land are being referred to here. Hellenistic Jews were those who continued to consider themselves Jewish after they had become native Greek speakers and assimilated other aspects of Hellenistic culture. These Jews, for the most part, lived in centers of the diaspora, such as Alexandria in Egypt. Hellenistic Judaism did not survive the Classic Age. Some of it was assimilated into Christianity. Some passed into the pagan world, and some accepted rabbinic norms. The works of Philo of Alexandria, the philosopher and mystic, embody this group. His use of Greek allegorical interpretation to show that the Mosaic revelation had excelled the truths later discovered by Greek philosophy. The Septuagint was Hellenistic Judaism's most influential legacy. It would strongly influence Christianity, specifically the Greek-speaking Gentile church. The New Testament would often quote the Septuagint. In diaspora communities, Gentile converts to Judaism were not uncommon. To convert required instruction, followed by self-baptism, reenacting the Exodus deliverance from the Red Sea. Men had to be circumcised, though many did not take this full step of conversion. But if their wives were Jewish, either by birth or conversion, their children were Jews. The rabbis of the time called the followers of Jesus of Nazareth the Nazareans. They called themselves, according to the New Testament, the Way. In Antioch, they were called Christians. They were a small messianic group that arose in the 1st century CE. And now we turn our attention to the Jewish literature which emerged in this time period. The Deuterocanon, or Apocrypha, consists of works not found in the Tanakh, but included in most Septuagint manuscripts, as well as most Greek and Latin copies of the Christian Old Testament. It is widely assumed that these books were regarded as canonical by Hellenistic Jewish communities during this period, even though they were not part of the Hebrew canon. In Chapter 1, we came to see that the primary difference between the Catholic and Orthodox Bible with the traditional Protestant Bible is the exclusion or inclusion of the Deuterocanon. 1st Esdras and 1st and 2nd Maccabees are historical narratives. 1st Esdras, called 3rd Esdra in Roman Catholic Bibles, closely parallels sections of the Hebrew canon. 2nd Chronicles 35-36, as well as Nehemiah chapters 7 and 8. 1st Maccabees covers the period from 168 to 134 BCE, when the Maccabean revolt threw off Seleucid control. 2nd Maccabees parallels 1st Maccabees 1-7, but it stresses miracles and divine appearances. It develops a theological interpretation of history that holds that the persecution of the Jews by Antiochus was a form of discipline. Tobit, Judith, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon are short stories that teach moral lessons. Tobit shows how the righteousness of ordinary people is rewarded. Judith is a historical romance in which the heroic action of a woman saves her people from an oppressor. And Susanna and Bel and the Dragon are additions to the book of Daniel. I invite you now to take a few moments to search for one of these stories and read them. Look at them from the literary and historical perspective, and finally ask, what's the message for you? The Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus are wisdom literature. The Wisdom of Solomon purports to be an address by King Solomon to the rulers of the world, showing that the wisdom of the Tanakh is superior to the wisdom of the Gentiles. The work is a creative synthesis of ideas drawn from canonical wisdom writings, for example, reward of the righteous and punishment of the evil, with Greek concepts such as the immortality of the soul. Wisdom is personified as an independent agent. Although there are no direct citations of the wisdom of Solomon in the New Testament, the theme of a personified, pre-existent wisdom may have been part of the background for the Logos in the prologue to the Gospel of John. The imagery of the whole armor of God was adapted by the Apostle Paul in several of his letters. Ecclesiasticus, like Ecclesiastes, is an old teacher's collected wisdom. The work is an anthology of aphorisms, brief essays, hymns to wisdom, reflections on existence, and advice on proper conduct. Its style and view of life are similar to those found in Proverbs. Its most famous catalogue of heroes may be the inspiration for a similar passage in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. Altogether, we can see that these works draw on the rich Jewish literary heritage as well as Greek thought and concepts. The larger Apocrypha is a term applied to Jewish religious writings from this period that are not regarded as canonical by any substantial Jewish or Christian group today. They are commonly collected under the title pseudepigrapha by modern scholars. You can find summaries of the larger Apocrypha in your textbook, page 210. There is influence of apocalyptic themes and imagery found in larger Apocrypha on the New Testament. For example, the Son of Man, who will come at the end of time to judge the world, can be found in the first book of Enoch, chapters 37-71. And this is evident in the Gospels, for example, in Mark chapter 8, verse 38. The Dead Sea Scrolls are writings found in about a dozen caves in the hills of the western shore of the Dead Sea, near the ruins of the Covenanters' community at Qumran. The scrolls include canonical and deuterocanonical works, but also a number of non-canonical writings from this period. The scrolls were most likely the library of the Qumran community. Biblical documents have been of great value for the study of the history of the text of the Tanakh. The other scrolls shed light on the sect that lived here, and so on the larger context of Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. The influence of the scrolls and the New Testament writings is still a source of ongoing scholarly inquiry. For example, the Sons of Light, which is found in a variety of New Testament books, is not found in the Tanakh, but is common in the other scrolls from the Qumran community. The term rabbinic literature refers to the body of traditions of Pharisaic Judaism that were circulated orally throughout most of this period and first published in written form in 200 CE. Its literary history is complex, such that it cannot be used uncritically as historical data. Used with care, it provides a rich source for understanding the circles that created and preserved it and the historical world in which they lived. Rabbinic traditions are divided into two categories of authority. The first, halakha, which means the way, lays down obligatory principles on the way people should order their lives. And the second, haggadah, which means narration, helps one understand God and the holy life. The literature can be divided into three major categories. The first, Talmudic. At the heart of the Talmud tradition is the Mishnah. These are the written rabbinic oral tradition. The Mishnah plus the Gemara, which are anecdotes, decisions, and discussion on the Mishnah, make up the Talmud. Midrashic literature includes midrash, or biblical interpretation, of which there are two types. Halakhic midrash, made only on the legal sections of the Torah, and Haggadic midrash, which treats every book in the Tanakh. The Targum are translations of the Bible into Aramaic. The Babylonian Talmud and the classic Halakhic midrashim remain authoritative for traditional observant Jews today. A number of literary forms in the rabbinic literature were used by New Testament authors. For example, the parables of Jesus are similar in style to the rabbinic parables. Paul uses rabbinic forms in his letters. For example, his retelling of the story of Abraham in Romans 4 is an example of Haggadic midrash.